welcome everyone. My talk is about web components, and um, to start off, web components are close to my heart because next to my daily job, I'm also writing a music player in my spare time using front-end technology, and I think I've rewritten certain parts of that music player now for 6 or 7 times already, because every time there's a new or better framework that I wanted to use, right? So I started off a gazillion years ago with something like jQuery, and nowadays it progressed to Angular JS, and I've seen knockout in few of the components move to Angular JS, and then to Angular, and then to React, and then to Vue, and then to, well, I don't want to do that every time for every single component that I build. So when I read about web components, I was really, really excited. So I asked myself a question. Then the question is, I'd like to display my album art because, like I've said, I'm creating a music player, and a music player, except for playing music, also needs to look pretty. So I need something like an artist or an album name to display the art. So, for example, my favorite artist is called Arian, and I want to display a picture of the man on his page in my player. Um, but of course, if I then jump to the for me still best album of this year, which is Omega by Epica, then I should show that album art. And the question itself is actually quite simple, but it requires quite some work actually to do it properly because, well, I have to find it somewhere. I want to add some caching to it because the next time I want to use that album art, I don't want to refetch it from the internet, but I probably already have it somewhere in my cache. I've different file sizes or image sizes, of course, that I need to take into account, and maybe even nowadays think about which format to send. Is it always a JPEG, or is it maybe even better to send a new format like WebP or something else? And of course, there are more than a gazillion other things that you can think of. And I want to do all that without bothering anyone else. So if you want to use my web component for showing album art, the only thing that you need to remember are the artist and the album name and nothing else. I will do the heavy lifting. So what I can do is write my magic in a function and then return the magic once it's done. So in this case, I'll do some fetching, and once it's done, I'll return an image tag with the proper source attribute set, which I can always include in another page, and then use that inner HTML. No, never trust external HTML. Never ever use the inner HTML attribute. Just don't do it. So we need to think of something else. We also need to think of something else because it probably becomes way too complex sooner than you think, because, well, we have some shared knowledge that we need to think about if we're doing it the pure programmed JavaScript way, or perhaps you need to copy paste a lot of my code in your own project. Who's responsible for the styling? Of course, for an image, it's only an image, but there are probably a lot of other components that I can reuse as well that I might want to share with someone else. And who's responsible for the styling? Is that the page or is that the component? Um, of course, we have iframes, but that's not always the solution. Just think about mobile devices. Uh, it's not always the best user experience. So let's just make it a, well, insert your favorite framework here, component. Yeah, but we're using another one, so sorry. In that case, good luck. I'm out of here. Oh, and by the way, please write it in TypeScript, of course. And well, I'm out of here, and I'll see you when I'm back. This is probably not your favorite coworker that says this, or, well, it's probably not yourself. So hopefully, I'm here. Hi, my name is Lucien Immink. I'm hopefully not that least favorite person I was referring to. That's my face. I'm a software architect and a developer advocate at Isaac, that's becoming IO, and we're situated in Eindhoven, where we have a lovely building. And on this picture, you also see the Friso Geerlingsplantsoen, because, well, as we all know, Friso Geerlings is a famous Eindhovenaar and also my CTO, and he was complaining about all the gray in front of the building. So what he actually, so he wrote to to the city of Eindhoven and asked, "Can we add something green?" And they did. So if you're ever near Eindhoven and or ever near our office and you see the patch of green in front of the building, thanks to this guy, Friso Heerlings. But I'm not going to talk about Friso. No, I'm going to talk about web components. And in order to talk about and in order to show what web components can do, we need to understand what web components are. So let's take a look at the technology behind web components. And web components, they fix a few things that I was just talking about. Like instead of having to copy paste an enormous amount of HTML, I can write a template. A template is actually an element for holding HTML. So here's an example in which I have I've wrapped my card component in a template, gave the template an ID so I can easily find it again, and I've added my normal HTML into it. But we do need to remember that if I add this to a page, the part within the template tag is not live. That means that the image that I've added will not be fetched. The CSS that is applied to the page will not be applied to the HTML elements inside this template. And if I've added a script to this template, it will not be executed. Well, what I can do is target the template by using JavaScript and then clone the contents of a template, apply whatever I need to do. So for example, I can update the source attribute of the image tag and then append that piece of HTML to my document. So for example, append it to the body. When that happens, the images are fetched. The CSS is applied to the nodes, and if there's script in the template which is copied, then that script is executed. Which fixes, if I go back, which actually fixes the copy pasting part, because I can provide a template or the mechanism to hold a template that once you've initiated my web component, I send the template over as a new DOM part that you can actually use in your page. Next to templates, we have custom elements, and custom elements are something completely different. So in normal HTML, we have elements like an unordered list or a list item or a paragraph. But you can also nowadays with web components have the ability to create custom elements that encapsulate my functionality on an HTML page instead of copy pasting over again those large amounts of HTML elements. So how do we do that? We use JavaScript, of course, and what we do is we extend the HTML element, so the default HTML element. If we want to override the constructor, we always need to call super first. Of course, it is one of the basics for object-oriented programming, which is what we're doing here. Maybe unfortunately for the React guys watching. But this gives me the possibilities to extend the inner workings of an HTML element. So I can add my magic. So also, for example, cloning the template into live DOM elements. I can do that in my own class now. And if I want to use that new element somewhere, the only thing that I need to do is to call it on the define of the custom elements namespace. So I point to a name album-art, and I point that name to my class. And every time the browser now sees a tag album-art, it will instantiate a new instance of the album art class. We can also customize built-in elements. So in this example, I have a sortable list, which is by default or by definition also an ordered list. So what I can do is I can extend the functionality of the ordered list by introducing new functionalities, either on the constructor or in different parts of the class, to extend the functionality of what's already there. So I don't have to start off always with the base element, but I can also extend more complex elements like a list element or maybe something else. And I can use them anywhere. So in this case, I have an alien page. This is someone else who created a page about Tupac, and he wanted to use my album art component. So he introduced it in his page as if it's part of his DOM. He also used the slot, and with the slot we have the ability to tell the web component, hey, if you have something that you can render in a part that you called a bio, this is the content that you need to use. The placement of that bio is not directly in the web component, but the web component can determine where it should be placed. So maybe I did say that not correctly. It doesn't mean that the P that you see here is the first element in the web component. No, it can be anywhere. It's defined by the web component and not by the alien page, though the content of the bio is defined by the alien page and not the web component. Right. If you want to do some more gangsta lorem ipsum, that's the URL you need to use. Just like normal HTML elements, we have some lifecycle callbacks that we can use, that we can hook into to make sure that we do some cleanup or something else where needed. So, for example, we have a connected callback, and the connected callback is called whenever a web component is added to a page. The opposite, of course, is the disconnected callback. So, called when we remove it from a page. There's also the adopted callback, and that's a different one. It's actually for if you have the very specific situation where you have multiple documents on the same page. So for example, with frames, and you move the component between the different frames. That's when the adopted callback is used. But the mostly used callback is the attribute changed callback. So every time either code or the end user, or well, maybe someone who's using the developer tools is changing the attributes, this callback is called. So you can make dynamic elements just like a normal HTML element. But the thing is, so far, I haven't touched the thing called styling and the issue that we have with styling, because there is a big issue with styling. And if I have that bio, for example, it's a paragraph, it's put somewhere, but probably the page itself has some definition of, well, I want this font with this font size, with this line height, and maybe I have a specific color for my anchors, while the web component might want to do something else. If you want to do that, you can use the shadow DOM, and the shadow DOM is actually a mechanism for allowing a hidden DOM tree to be attached to the regular DOM tree. So in this picture, what I've tried to show here is that although it's not visible for the document, you still have a DOM for the web component. And from the web component's view, you have a DOM that you can work with while you're not able to extend beyond your reach doesn't extend beyond that shadow DOM. So if you, as the web component developer, defines, for example, a color on the links, right? You only define that color on your own links and not that of the document that embeds your web component. If you want to use the shadow DOM, it's actually quite easy. You call a attach shadow from the component, and then you add your DOM to that shadow, and it will be automatically created as a shadow DOM. There are two modes that you can use. It's either open, meaning JavaScript from the outside world can access your elements by just targeting them, and closed means, well, we try to deny the access from the outside world, because it will return null instead of the DOM itself. Well, actually, there are still ways to do this. Even though you close the shadow DOM, you're still able to target them if you know how you need to do it. I've written an example. So on line 2, I've added the shadow to the underscore root variable of the of my class, and somewhere else JS, I have targeted the web component, but then if I ask, can you give me your shadow root, it returns null because it's closed. But if I know the name or query the name, or well, find out what the name is, I can still call it, and actually I can still change what happens. I can still change the input of the elements inside the shadow root, as shown in this example. So it's closed. I get an undefined. But I have my web component, and I just query the paragraph inside the shadow root and change its content, which is doable even though the shadow root is closed. So the question is, do you want to close it, or yeah, I probably say no. If you want to add some more HTML elements to your shadow root, it's actually just adding normal, in this case, plain old JavaScript code to make sure that you create the elements that you want, update the attributes. Maybe the web component has a specific attribute for an image, and then you can update the image URL inside the shadow and attach it to the shadow in the end, line 14. So now we have a way to control the contents of the web component. We have a way to control the styling with the shadow root, and we don't have to copy paste a lot of knowledge between the different people, because we have that one liner, which is the web component, the custom element. So now we need styling, and like I've said, if you use the shadow, you can add a style sheet to the shadow root as well, which will only be available within the shadow root. So the fact that I'm saying that an image is display block with an object fit cover is only for the images inside this web component. And the cool thing is we can combine web components with CSS variables. So what we can have is actually a set of variables that we can get from the parent document, and use those. And if they're not found, we can always introduce the fallbacks, like the fallbacks work with CSS variables. This gives us a good opportunity to not only control the styling of the web component versus the page, but also making sure that the web component can be made in the same look and feel without having breaking changes, or the ability to break anything within the web component. If I have a theme with a background, with the variable background, I can use that, and if I don't have it, I have a fallback. So CSS variables and shadow DOM, how does that work? If I don't have a shadow DOM, we're just using global styling. That's probably not what you want, but there are some cases where you do want a web component without a shadow DOM. But if I have a shadow DOM, the styling is scoped. But if I have a shadow DOM and I use CSS variables, I can still access the CSS variables from the main page. Well, the CSS variables that are set in the main page will also be used in the web component if you're using, of course, that name in your CSS within the web component. So my take on this would be go for the last one, use CSS variables and a shadow DOM. So I've talked about, oh, it's getting dark. I have talked about getting the web component production ready. Well, sort of. I've shown the different parts of a web component. So that's the shadow DOM, the template, and the custom element. But yeah, we probably already have something. So how do we integrate a web component within something else? Well, if you just have plain HTML, it's downloading the web component with, as long as it has that trigger to be defined on the custom elements namespace, it will be used in your page. But if you're using a framework, so for example, Angular, the thing with Angular is you need to tell the Angular compiler that it doesn't need to do anything with custom elements, because otherwise it will try to use the custom element as if it's an Angular component, and then the compiler will fail because it's not an Angular component. It can't find the component because it's a runtime component. So the thing you do in Angular is just you tell in the app module, you tell Angular, please, I have a custom elements schema from the Angular core, and telling Angular everything that you can't find is a custom element. Well, once you've done that, you can import the component and use it. That also means that if you make a typo, for example, albumed art, it will just render that, because we've told the Angular compiler, don't look at anything except for the component that you can find. React, super easy. Well, the basics are super easy. You don't have to do anything. You just need to import the component and then you can start using it. But the problem with React will be that it has some issues with the props and the custom elements, and the custom events that are sent to and from the web component. Luckily, there are a few wrapper components that you can now use, which will actually translate the basic web component properties to React components and vice versa. So you need to wrap, as far as I know for now, you need to wrap every single web component that you want to use in such a wrapper component, and then you can use it in React with props and custom element properties and event listeners. For Vue, at least for Vue 2, what you need to do is to call, again, just like Angular, tell the compiler, please ignore this. But in Vue, you can define what you want to ignore. So this is a regular expression that says, please ignore the name album art. If I make a typo, it's not ignored. If I compile my template, which has a typo, it will throw an error. But if I got it right, I can use it in my template. Hey, now I've got a web component in a template tag in Vue. Yes, Vue is actually using the template tag, which was introduced for web components. Oh, you can create web components using vanilla JS, of course, and the web components standard, but you probably don't want to do that if you are going to create a lot of them. There are a few libraries that can help you out. Lit, or Polymer, as it used to be called. Well, actually, Polymer was the library that was invented before Lit, and it's now deprecated in favor of Lit. Lit is a framework from Google to help you create web components with the minimum amount of extra sauce. So it helps you out in a few of the basics, but you still need to do a lot yourself. Stencil is a little bit bigger, for example, and has a real focus on design systems. So if you ever want to create a new design system or UI components, have a look at Stencil. It's quite an interesting approach on creating those components and also on consuming those components in your normal project. So I've shown you web components and how to integrate them. I also want to show some examples just to help you out with, well, cool, those web components, but what can I do with it? Well, a friend of mine made this, the render plant UML component. As a software architect, I'm creating a lot of pictures, a lot of diagrams, and the UML diagrams are one of them. But I need to keep them up to date, and to do that, I have I'm running a plant UML server, but I still need to tell the plant UML server to render the new image and then send that image back. The cool thing with the render plant UML web component is I can specify the server that will render the image, and then just add the UML as a body, and it will return an image that will be rendered in place of the HTML tag. Up to date always. So if I change anything, in the body, it will, with page refresh, will also update the image, which is cool for when I'm using it in my documentation. There's also a thing called the API viewer, which is actually built for Stencil, where Stencil will give you a sort of an API for your web components and put them in the custom elements JSON file. What this web component does is it reads that custom elements JSON file and gives you an overview of what is possible. So the documentation of your web components can be consumed by a web component and shared with other teams, of course. You know that every time the JSON updates, well, the documentation will be updated with it automatically because the JSON is the documentation. But you can also use web components as a utility. So for a grid, for modals, complete wizards, takeovers, endless list, endless scrolls, even date pickers. It's I've written too many date pickers in my time, and I don't ever want to write any date picker again. But if my project moves from one framework to another, there's always the question: well, do we have a date picker that does exactly what we need to do? If I have one as a web component, that's one less worry to worry about, one less thing to worry about. Sorry. And of course, there's a web component nowadays for album art. So I've built this web component and I've added some styling on my page to display them in a grid where I tell the grid to be a grid, and of course, and I tell my album art that it's 100% in width and it's a block element. The cool thing is, since we're using HTML, I can edit anything that I want. So if I'm going to change my flavor in music, and Arian is no longer my favorite artist, but Muse has become my favorite artist, it's easily updated because what I've done here is I've used the attribute change callback because the page changed and I've pressed save, but of course you can't see that because it's on my keyboard. But I've pressed the save button and now the web component was triggered to update to fetch the new album art of the artist and or album that it found. So in this case, it was Muse. Sorry. No. Oh, always the God damn it. Lol. Sorry, guys. The demo ghost needed a sacrifice. Okay. Right. Nearing the end. Phew, luckily. So hopefully I've given you some insights in what web components are. They're actually APIs to create new custom reusable HTML tags with a controlled style and markup that, if you use a shadow DOM, cannot leak. Custom elements built on the web component standards will work across modern browsers and can be used with any JavaScript library or framework that you want, as long as that framework is using HTML. I've shown you that web components are templates, custom elements, and a shadow DOM, and that they love CSS variables. They integrate quite well with modern frameworks, and of course, that they can fetch album art. I'd like to thank you for your time, and if you want to know more, please you can contact me on any of the following links. And if you have any questions, I think that we have some time for some Q&A.
Thank you, Lucien. Very cool. Yeah, as I said before, I don't have any experience with web components, so it's always nice to kind of see someone that actually knows what they're doing explain this kind of stuff. It's easy to get stuck in a loop of YouTube videos and tutorials, but this is always usually straight to the point. there's a couple of questions that have been posted. So
Right.
if you're okay with me just firing them at you. First one, if I want to get started with web components, what's your advice?
Start small.
Okay. Where would that be?
Sorry?
Where would that be? What's starting small in your opinion?
In my opinion, I would start with just one component, and one thing that's rather standalone. So you can have, of course, a component that's part of a bigger thing. Like if you look at it at your design system,
A date picker, for instance.
yeah, well, the date picker is standalone, of course, but it's also built up of a lot of smaller components that you probably want to tackle first. So if yeah, thinking
I was
of it,
just
well,
mentioning the date picker because you said you were sick of writing them.
I am. I actually think that something like, well, like I've shown with fetching album art is, I think even quite a nice exercise to start with, because you will touch the different parts of a web component, like the template, like the custom element, like the CS, the shadow DOM and the scoped CSS, but it doesn't interfere with a lot of other things. Or maybe something like a modal or
Yeah,
of
just
canvas
something
menu,
basic.
stuff like that.
Okay. Yeah, next question was in regards to styling. It seemed like CSS and JS. Can you also use variables from JavaScript?
It's a good question, and I actually haven't have any experience doing that. So, I know that you can easily call all properties that are set on a web component, right? Since it's just a normal HTML element, so you can set style elements and custom properties on a web component. And I think that if you listen to it, that you can consume those as well. But I've never tried it like that, actually. Good question.
Cool. Guess that's something for all of us to find out then. We're curious. Okay. CSS will not leak out of a shadow DOM. But what about CSS from outside into a shadow DOM? Is it possible to have global styling?
Yes.
Okay. It's a straightforward one. I see there's also a couple in the chat now as well from the audience. If you
Cool.
guys could use the Q&A section, that'd be great. Do you think that front-end frameworks can become obsolete in favor of web components?
No.
As from
I
what you've said, I think it's
I
basically a
think
little bit of both.
I do hope that they can that they play nice with each other. So, for example, that if I look at a UI web component, a UI component library, I would imagine, for example, let's take something that will never happen. Well, Material UI, or Material UI from Google. We have implementations for Material UI now in every single major framework, of course, and probably for some of the frameworks, even more of the more implementations. And now Material UI switches to Material U, or what's it called? I think it was Material U, the new design system from Android 12.
I'll be honest, I haven't looked into it.
It's a little bit different, but anyhow, all those libraries need to be or can be rewritten. And the thing is, it can be that one of the libraries is in front of another one, but written in a framework that you don't use. So, for example, it's written in Angular, and you don't want to use Angular in your project due to reasons, or you don't want to ship an extra few 100 kilobytes just for the UI components. And there, I think that if those components are the DOM components, at least, if those are written using web components, that they only need to be written once for for stuff like that, while the consumers can use whichever library they want.
Yeah, that completely makes sense. It
But I
also
don't
means you
think
don't.
that web components will completely replace the complex logic that we do at the moment using React or Vue. No, I don't think so.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, that makes complete sense. We also have another question from Nick. With the rise of server-side technologies, I'm not going to name them all, but how do you see web components stacked together in that environment?
There's actually some movement going on in getting server-side rendered web components. So that's quite interesting, of course, that you still have that you can have a server-side rendered state of the web component and that it's rehydrated afterwards. But yeah, I wouldn't say by definition, but most implementations of web components are purely client-side at the moment. So it will be interesting to see how they, again, will work together. I know that, like I said, I've seen some movement in getting web components on the server with state rendering on the server and then sending over state. I haven't touched that topic myself yet, so not entirely sure.
Yeah, cool. No, it makes sense. It's a little bit of a deep dive, and from what you said, at least with this project that you're working on, I would assume you don't really need server-side rendering. So cool.
No, not at the moment.
Yeah. One last question. Adoption of web components is still quite low. What is going to be needed to expand the adoption of web components? What do you think about that? It's a hard one.
For low-hanging fruit, quick adoption, I would say better or easier integration with a few very specific frameworks that are used quite a lot, namely React.
Yeah, that would make sense. You did mention in your last slide, I think it was about can be used with anything that uses HTML.
Yeah.
Does that exclude JSX?
No, it doesn't, but it doesn't play very nice with JSX.
Okay. So
due to the fact that of course, where it's not the target of JSX is not the DOM itself, and this is purely DOM based. So that's why you have those wrapper components nowadays for React. Sorry, to send over the events and the properties to and from the React world, so to say. But yeah, I think that at least I hope that the adoption of web components will be bigger once once that integration is where we want it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, one last question, because I see Sad, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, posted one more question. Basically, what learning resources would you advise for devs who want to dig deeper into web components? It seems like you're getting grilled today. Sorry about that.
I would say, well, the documentation that Google wrote on their dev site is quite extensive for getting to know how and why to use web components. So I would start there, actually. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks. I had one more thing. Maybe I'm not sure if it's open source, but if you would like to share maybe a project on the music player, the audio player, that'd be pretty cool. I'm sure some people would like to take a look into that if it's open source. Besides that, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate the talk.